Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries, where we explore the incredible achievements and forgotten wonders of human history. If you're enjoying these deep dives into humanity's most fascinating accomplishments, please consider subscribing and following along. Each day we uncover a different story of human ingenuity, and today's journey takes us to the beginning of the 15th century, to an achievement so magnificent that it would take centuries for the rest of the world to match it. In the year 1405, something impossible appeared on the horizon of the South China Sea. Not one ship, not a dozen ships, but 317 vessels, moving together like a floating city across the water. At the centre of this armada sailed ships so massive that modern engineers still debate whether they could have actually existed. Ships with 9 towering masts, carrying 500 men each. Ships 4 times longer than anything Europe would build for another century. Ships that dwarfed the vessels Christopher Columbus would sail decades later like toys in a bathtub. This was the treasure fleet of Admiral Zheng He, and it represented the peak of Chinese maritime power. For nearly 3 decades, from 1405 to 1433, these magnificent vessels would traverse 25,000 miles of ocean, reaching from China to the eastern coast of Africa, establishing trade networks, projecting imperial power, and accomplishing feats of navigation and seamanship that wouldn't be matched until the age of steel and steam. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. While Europe was still centuries away from developing ocean-going vessels, while most of the world believed the seas were unconquerable barriers, China had already mastered them. The treasure fleet wasn't exploring unknown waters. They were travelling established routes with such precision, such organisation, and such technological sophistication that they could sail for months out of sight of land and arrive exactly where they intended. How did they do it? How did 15th century China build wooden ships larger than any wooden vessels constructed before or since? How did they navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean without GPS, without modern instruments, with nothing but their ingenuity and the stars? How did they organise fleets of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, keeping them supplied, coordinated, and effective across voyages lasting years? Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most remarkable maritime achievements. We're going to discover how a boy named Ma He, captured by Chinese forces and made a eunuch, would rise to become Admiral Zheng He, commander of the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. We're going to examine the ships themselves, vessels so advanced in their design that they incorporated technologies Europe wouldn't develop for centuries. And we're going to understand why, at the very moment when China stood poised to dominate global trade and exploration, they chose to turn inward, burning their ships and forbidding ocean voyages, allowing their extraordinary maritime knowledge to fade into legend. This is the story of human capability at its peak, of engineering triumph, of navigational genius, and of the cultural forces that can elevate or extinguish greatness. This is the story of Zheng He's treasure fleet. The man who would command history's greatest fleet was born in 1371 in landlocked Yunnan province, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. His birth name was Ma He, and he grew up in a prosperous Muslim family during a time of tremendous upheaval in China. The Mongol Yuan dynasty was collapsing, and Chinese forces under the Ming were reasserting control over the empire. When Ma He was just 10 or 11 years old, Ming forces swept through Yunnan. In the chaos of conquest, his father was killed, and young Ma He was captured. Like many boys taken in war, he was castrated and sent into service. But this wasn't the end of his story. It was, impossibly, the beginning. The boy was assigned to the household of Zhu Di, one of the emperor's sons, the Prince of Yan. And here, Ma He demonstrated something that would define his entire life: exceptional intelligence, unwavering loyalty, and remarkable leadership abilities. He received both literary and military training, quickly rising through the ranks of the prince's household. He learned strategy, diplomacy, navigation, and the arts of war. In 1399, Prince Zhu Di decided to rebel against his own nephew, the Jianwen Emperor. It was a bold, dangerous move, and Ma He proved instrumental in its success. At the Battle of Zhengdike in Beijing, he led the prince's forces to a crucial victory. The military campaign was brutal and uncertain, but Ma He's tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment helped turn the tide. By 1402, Prince Zhu Di had captured Nanjing and claimed the throne as the Yongle Emperor. The Jianwen Emperor probably died in a palace fire, though rumours persisted that he had escaped. And the new emperor, grateful to his faithful eunuch, bestowed upon Ma He a new surname, Zheng. Ma He became Zheng He. According to official records, Zheng He was an imposing figure, standing over 7 feet tall in an era when most men were far shorter. He was described as having a stride like a tiger's and a voice like a great bell. But more than his physical presence, Zheng He possessed something far more valuable: the complete trust of the emperor. The Yongle Emperor had grand ambitions for China. For centuries, Confucian advisors had convinced emperors to look inward, to restrict foreign trade, to view the outside world with suspicion. But Yongle wanted to reverse this. He wanted to re-establish the tributary system, to bring foreign nations into China's sphere of influence through trade and diplomacy rather than conquest. He wanted, in his words, to bring the Western Ocean into the Chinese tributary system by overawing, or if need be overpowering, opposition. To accomplish this vision, he needed a fleet unlike any the world had seen, and he needed a commander who combined diplomatic skill, military prowess, navigational knowledge, and unshakable loyalty. He chose Zheng He. In 1403, the emperor ordered the construction of a fleet that would make his vision real. The project was staggering in scope. Hundreds of ships would need to be built. Tens of thousands of men would need to be recruited, trained, and organized. The logistical challenges were immense, but the Ming dynasty had resources, expertise, and determination. The heart of this massive undertaking was the Longjiang shipyard in Nanjing, located on the western side of the Qinhuai River estuary. This wasn't just any shipyard. It was a government-run industrial complex specifically designed to build the treasure fleet. At its peak, it contained more than 10 shipbuilding basins where massive vessels could be constructed simultaneously. The shipwrights who worked at Longjiang were masters of their craft, drawing on centuries of Chinese maritime tradition. They weren't starting from scratch. Chinese shipbuilding had been advanced for centuries. They had developed dry docks in the 10th century, more than 400 years before dry docks appeared in Europe. They had pioneered watertight bulkhead compartments, inspired by their observations of bamboo's hollow, segmented structure. If the builders of the Titanic had paid attention to Chinese ship design, that tragedy might never have occurred. The ships they would build for Zheng He fell into several categories, each designed for specific purposes. There were the Machuan, specialized vessels for transporting horses. There were supply ships for carrying provisions, water ships for transporting fresh water on long voyages, and troop transports for the thousands of soldiers who would provide security. There were fast warships designed to pursue and engage pirates. And then there were the treasure ships themselves, the Bao Chuan. These were the flagships, the vessels that carried the admiral, the imperial officials, and the vast quantities of trade goods and tribute that gave the fleet its name. The size of these treasure ships has been a subject of intense debate for centuries. According to the History of Ming, compiled in 1739, the largest treasure ships measured 44 zhang and 4 qi. Using the measuring standards of the Ming dynasty, that translates to approximately 447 feet long and 180 feet wide. To put that in perspective, that would make them longer than a modern football field and wider than a 4-lane highway. If those dimensions are accurate, these would be by far the largest wooden ships ever built in human history, exceeding anything constructed until the age of steel. Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, built nearly a century later, was only about 62 feet long. Vasco da Gama's largest ship was perhaps 100 feet. The treasure ships, if the historical records are correct, dwarfed them by a factor of 4 or more. But many modern scholars are skeptical. Could wooden ships really be built that large? Wood has natural structural limits. When you build a ship beyond a certain size, the hull begins to experience tremendous stress from its own weight and from wave action. European ship designers in later centuries found that wooden ships much over 300 feet experienced severe structural problems. They would hog or sag in the middle, their frames would crack, and they often proved unseaworthy. Archaeological evidence provides some clues but doesn't definitively settle the question. In 1957, excavations at the Longjiang shipyard uncovered a massive rudder shaft made of Mesoferria wood, an extremely valuable and dense hardwood. This rudder shaft measured 36 feet long. Only the deepest ocean-going vessels of the Ming dynasty were equipped with rudders made of this precious wood. The rudder blade itself, which didn't survive, was estimated to have an area of over 450 square feet. Using the dimensions of this rudder, engineers have calculated that the ship it belonged to must have been at least 200 to 250 feet long. That's still enormous for a wooden vessel, but notably smaller than the 447-foot length claimed in later historical texts. Additional rudder shafts were discovered in later excavations, confirming that Longjiang was building ships of extraordinary size. The shipbuilding basins themselves provide another clue. Archaeological excavations of Basin No. 6 revealed the foundations where ships were constructed. These foundations were long enough to accommodate very large vessels, perhaps 200 to 300 feet, but the basins were only about 41 meters wide, about 135 feet. That's wide enough for a large ship, but not wide enough for the 180-foot width claimed in some historical accounts. Contemporary records from people who actually saw Zheng He's ships offer additional perspective. Gong Zhen, who served as Zheng He's secretary during the seventh and final voyage, from 1431 to 1433, wrote that the treasure ships required crews of 200 to 300 sailors each. A Ming minister named Song Li indicated that the standard ratio was 1 man per 2.5 tons of cargo, which would suggest ships of 500 to 750 tons displacement. An inscription at the Jinghai Temple in Nanjing, dating from Zheng He's era, mentions ships of 2,000 liao and 1,500 liao. A liao is a unit of displacement, and scholars debate its exact equivalent, but most agree it represents somewhere between 500 and 100 pounds. Using the lower estimate, a 2,000 liao ship would displace about 500 tons. Using the higher estimate, perhaps 100 tons. Either way, these are substantial vessels, but not the 20,000-ton behemoths that some later accounts describe. In 2010, archaeologists discovered a new inscription in the tomb of Hong Bao, one of Zheng He's principal officers. This inscription mentions the construction of a 5,000 liao ship, the largest mentioned in any contemporary source. If we use the higher displacement estimate, that would be a vessel of approximately 2,700 tons with a calculated length of about 233 feet. A ship of this size would be genuinely impressive, larger than most European vessels of the next 3 centuries, but still within the realm of what wooden ship construction could achieve. So what can we conclude? The truth likely lies somewhere between the skeptics who argue the ships were relatively modest and the enthusiasts who take the 447-foot length at face value. Zheng He's largest treasure ships were probably in the range of 200 to 300 feet long, displacing perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 tons. That would make them the largest wooden ships of their era, genuinely revolutionary in scale, but not physically impossible. But size alone doesn't capture what made these ships remarkable. The treasure ships incorporated advanced design features that gave them capabilities European ships wouldn't match for centuries. The most important innovation was the watertight bulkhead compartment system. Chinese shipbuilders had observed that bamboo is light and buoyant because it's divided into sealed chambers. They applied this principle to ship design, dividing the hull into multiple watertight compartments, separated by thick wooden bulkheads. If the hull was breached in one location, water would flood only that compartment, not the entire ship. The vessel could remain afloat, even with significant damage. This wasn't just theoretical. Chinese ships with bulkhead compartments were far more survivable in storms and combat than Western vessels. European ships didn't widely adopt this design until the 18th and 19th centuries. When the Titanic was designed in the early 20th century, it used watertight compartments, but they weren't properly sealed at the top. Chinese shipbuilders had solved this problem 5 centuries earlier. The treasure ships also featured multiple masts. While the exact number is debated, most historians believe the largest vessels had between 5 and 9 masts. The accounts that mention 9 masts are considered less reliable, but even 5 or 6 masts would have been extraordinary for the time. Multiple masts allowed the ships to carry more sail area while keeping individual sails manageable. This provided more power and better control in varying wind conditions. The masts were staggered, placed at different positions along the hull, which distributed the structural loads and allowed for complex sail configurations. The ships could use different combinations of sails to optimize their performance for different wind angles and sea conditions. This level of sophistication in rigging wouldn't appear in European ships for another 2 centuries. The hull design itself was sophisticated. Ships built for coastal trade had flat bottoms which prevented them from running aground in shallow waters and allowed them to beach safely. But these flat-bottomed vessels weren't suitable for deep ocean sailing. For the treasure fleet, shipwrights from Fujian province developed a V-shaped hull with a deep keel, described in records as being sharp like a knife that could cut through big waves. This deep-keeled design provided stability in rough seas and allowed the ships to sail closer to the wind. The hulls featured a high, ornate prow and stern that kept the deck above the waves in heavy weather. The prow often incorporated dragon eyes, decorative elements that allowed the ship to see where it was heading, but which also served as structural reinforcements. The rudders themselves were marvels of engineering. Unlike European ships of the period, which had rudders attached to the stern with metal pins called pintles and gudgeons, Chinese ships had axial rudders. These rudders were mounted on a vertical post that extended through the hull, allowing the rudder to be raised or lowered depending on water depth. In shallow water, or when approaching shore, the crew could partially raise the rudder to reduce draft. In deep water and rough seas, they could lower it fully for maximum control. The construction methods were equally sophisticated. The ships were built using mortise and tenon joints, where precisely cut wooden pieces fitted together like puzzle pieces. These joints were reinforced with iron nails, up to 3 feet long. The planking was applied in multiple layers, with the seams sealed using a mixture of tung oil and lime powder, a waterproofing compound so effective that modern replica builders still use the same formula. Even small details showed remarkable craftsmanship. Archaeological excavations at Longjiang uncovered thin shells that had been cut into rectangular shapes and polished to a thickness of just 0.1 millimeters. These translucent shell pieces were incorporated into lattice windows on the ships, providing protection from wind and rain while allowing light into the cabins. It's a detail that speaks to the level of care and sophistication invested in every aspect of these vessels. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Zheng He's fleet wasn't the individual ships, no matter how magnificent. It was the organization of hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of people into an effective operational force. The first voyage, which departed in July 1405, consisted of 317 ships, carrying 27,170 men, according to most sources, though some accounts mention 255 ships. The exact number is less important than the scale. This was a floating city, larger than many towns of the period, and Zheng He kept this massive fleet organised, supplied, and functioning across voyages that lasted months or years. The fleet included not just sailors and soldiers, but specialists of every kind. There were doctors to treat the sick and injured. There were astrologers who helped predict weather and auspicious sailing dates. There were translators fluent in the languages of Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. There were cartographers who mapped the routes and documented the coastlines. There were pharmacologists who identified useful plants and medicines in foreign lands. There were scribes who recorded the diplomatic exchanges and trade negotiations. There were cooks who fed thousands of men daily. The ships themselves were specialized. Beyond the treasure ships, there were vessels designed specifically to carry horses for trade or military use. There were dedicated supply ships that carried dried foods, rice, grains, and other provisions. There were water ships equipped with ceramic jars for storing fresh water. There were fast patrol boats for reconnaissance and pursuit of pirates. The fleet's organization was hierarchical and precise. Zheng He commanded from one of the great treasure ships, but he had a cadre of senior officers who managed different squadrons. His second-in-command, Wang Jinghong, was also a court eunuch who had proven his capability. Other officers like Ho Xian, Li Qing, Hong Bao, Yang Zhen, and Zhang Da commanded different sections of the fleet, allowing for coordinated operations across hundreds of ships. When the fleet needed to accomplish multiple objectives, it could divide. Zheng He would lead the main fleet to the primary destinations, while subordinate commanders led detached squadrons to explore side routes, establish secondary trade contacts, or accomplish specific diplomatic missions. Then the squadrons would rendezvous at predetermined locations. The level of coordination required for this, across thousands of miles and months of time, was extraordinary. The fleet operated on a systematic schedule, driven by monsoon winds. They would depart China in winter, catching the northeast monsoon that would carry them south and west across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. They would spend months in foreign ports, conducting trade and diplomacy. Then they would return in summer on the southwest monsoon winds. The entire voyage could take a year or more. The route was well established, which helped with the organization. Chinese traders had been sailing to Southeast Asia and India for centuries, but what made Zheng He's voyages different was their scale, their official backing, and eventually their reach beyond the traditional trading zones. The fleet's first stop was always Quy Nhon in Champa, present-day Vietnam. From there, they would proceed to various ports in Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula. The Strait of Malacca was a critical choke point, and Zheng He established strong relations with the Sultan of Malacca, turning it into a key ally and trading hub. From Malacca, the fleet would cross the Bay of Bengal to reach India and Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. The ports of Calicut and Cochin on India's Malabar coast were major spice trading centres, and Zheng He's visits helped establish direct Chinese access to the pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, and other valuable commodities that had previously been controlled by Arab and Indian merchants. But Zheng He didn't just trade, he resolved conflicts. On the second voyage, the king of Ceylon attempted to plunder the treasure ships. Zheng He captured the king and brought him back to China, where he was released only after promising to pay tribute to the Ming emperor. On the third voyage in northern Sumatra, a usurper had seized power from the rightful king. Zheng He launched a military operation, defeating the usurper's forces and restoring the legitimate ruler. And always, there were the pirates. The seas of Southeast Asia were plagued by well-organized pirate fleets that controlled strategic waterways and preyed on merchant vessels. The most famous was Chen Zuyi, who had seized control of Palembang and dominated the Malaccan Strait. During the return from the first voyage in 1407, Zheng He engaged Chen's fleet in a major naval battle. The treasure fleet's superior ships and well-armed crews overwhelmed the pirates. Chen Zuyi was captured and later executed in Nanjing. Zheng He's victory didn't just protect his own fleet, it made the sea lanes safer for all merchants, enhancing China's prestige and influence. The fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh voyages extended even farther. After visiting the familiar ports of Southeast Asia and India, the fleet ventured into the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and down the eastern coast of Africa. They visited Hormuz, the great trading city, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. They sailed to Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea. Some detachments even reached Jeddah, close to the holy city of Mecca. Arab historians recorded the arrival of the Chinese ships with awe. Along the eastern coast of Africa, the fleet visited Mogadishu, Brava, and Malindi in present-day Somalia and Kenya. Archaeological excavations at these sites have uncovered Chinese porcelain and coins from the Ming dynasty, physical evidence of Zheng He's visits. In 2010, researchers discovered what may be an ancient Chinese anchor off the coast of Malindi, further corroborating the historical accounts. The treasures the fleet brought back to China were extraordinary. There were exotic animals, including zebras from Africa, and a giraffe that the Chinese court identified as a qilin, a mythical creature whose appearance was considered an auspicious omen. There were precious gems, chrysoberyl, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies from India and Persia. Over 3,400 pieces of Persian and Indian jewellery were discovered in a Ming-era tomb in Hubei province, likely treasures brought back by Zheng He's voyages. But perhaps more valuable than any physical treasure were the foreign ambassadors who returned to China with the fleet. Envoys from more than 30 kingdoms visited the Ming court, bringing tribute, pledging loyalty, and establishing diplomatic relationships. This was the real goal of the voyages: to demonstrate Chinese power and wealth, to establish China as the centre of the world order, to make it clear that the Ming dynasty was the preeminent civilization. The navigational capabilities required for these voyages were remarkable. The Chinese had been using magnetic compasses for navigation since at least the 11th century, several hundred years before they appeared in Europe. But a compass alone isn't enough to sail across thousands of miles of open ocean. Zheng He's fleet used sophisticated star charts. Chinese astronomers had mapped the positions of stars and constellations, allowing navigators to determine their latitude by measuring the altitude of celestial bodies above the horizon. They used cross-staffs and other instruments to take these measurements. The constellation charts were remarkably detailed, showing not just major stars, but patterns of dimmer stars that could be used for more precise positioning. The fleet also relied on detailed sailing directions that had been accumulated over centuries of Chinese maritime trade. These directions, sometimes called rutters in Western naval history, described routes, landmarks, water depths, currents, and safe anchorages. For familiar routes, the navigators knew exactly how many days of sailing in a particular direction would bring them to their destination. But even with all this knowledge, sailing for weeks out of sight of land required exceptional skill and nerve. Ocean currents could push a ship off course, storms could scatter a fleet, equipment could fail. The fact that Zheng He's fleet made 7 successful voyages, covering 25,000 miles, visiting dozens of foreign ports and returning safely each time, is a testament to extraordinary navigational mastery. Zheng He himself was more than just a military commander and diplomat. He was a genius of logistics and organization. Managing a fleet of this size required solving problems that no one had solved before. How do you keep hundreds of wooden ships seaworthy for months at sea? How do you supply fresh water for tens of thousands of men? How do you maintain discipline and morale during long voyages? How do you coordinate the movements of hundreds of vessels spread across miles of ocean? The answer was systematic planning and preparation. The treasure ships had large ceramic jars for storing water, and the fleet included specialized water ships that carried additional supplies. They would replenish at friendly ports along the route. The food supplies included dried fish, salted meat, rice, grains, and pickled vegetables. There's evidence that the ships even carried plants and livestock, providing fresh food during the voyage and gifts for foreign rulers. The ships carried repair materials and tools. When vessels needed maintenance, they could be careened at beaches, tipped on their sides so the hull could be accessed and repaired. The fleet included skilled carpenters, rope makers, and sail makers who could replace damaged components. The iron nails, some 3 feet long, that held the ships together could be reforged if needed. Medical care was sophisticated for the era. The doctors aboard could treat common ailments, set broken bones, and even perform some surgeries. They carried medicinal herbs and compounds. The survival rate on Zheng He's voyages appears to have been remarkably high compared to later European exploration voyages, where disease and scurvy often killed large percentages of the crew. Communication across the fleet was managed using flags, drums, bells, and at night, lanterns. Different signals indicated different commands: formation changes, danger warnings, Jiaoji orders for squadron commanders to report to the flagship. The system was sophisticated enough that a fleet of hundreds of ships could maneuver in coordination. The financial cost of these expeditions was enormous. Building the initial fleet absorbed about half of the Empire's tax receipts for 1 year. Then there were the ongoing costs of wages, supplies, maintenance, and the valuable goods carried as gifts and trade items. The Ming treasury bore a tremendous burden to sustain these voyages. But for the Yongle Emperor, the voyages were worth the cost. They brought prestige, they established tributary relationships, they secured access to valuable trade goods. They demonstrated to the world that China was powerful, wealthy, and culturally superior. In the emperor's mind, this justified the expense. However, not everyone in the Ming court agreed. Confucian scholars had long viewed foreign trade and naval expeditions with suspicion. They believed that China should be self-sufficient, that interactions with foreigners were corrupting, that the emperor's resources should be spent on internal improvements and defences against the Mongols to the north, not on expensive voyages to impress distant barbarians. These tensions simmered throughout Zheng He's career, but as long as the Yongle Emperor lived, the voyages continued. The first expedition departed in 1405, the second followed in 1407, the third in 1409, the fourth, which extended to Hormuz in 1413, the fifth, which reached Africa in 1417, the sixth in 1421. Each voyage enhanced China's prestige and influence. The diplomatic network expanded. The tributary system strengthened. Trade flourished. For a brief period in the early 15th century, China truly did rule the seas. But in 1494, the Yongle Emperor died. His son, the Hongxi Emperor, took the throne with different priorities. The new emperor was more sympathetic to the Confucian scholars who opposed the maritime expeditions. He halted the voyages almost immediately. The treasure fleet sat idle in harbour. Zheng He was appointed defender of Nanjing, a prestigious but landlocked position. The Hongxi Emperor's reign lasted only 1 year. His son, the Xuande Emperor, took the throne in 1425 and initially continued the policy of isolating China from maritime commerce. But in 1430, he changed his mind, perhaps recognizing the value of the tributary relationships his grandfather had established. He ordered Zheng He to undertake one final voyage. Zheng He was in his 60s by this point, far older than most men of his era, but he obeyed the emperor's command. The seventh voyage departed in 1430, visiting the familiar ports of Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa one last time. It was a farewell tour of the maritime world Zheng He had dominated for 3 decades. Zheng He died in 1433, either in Calicut or on the return journey to China. The exact circumstances of his death aren't recorded. He was 62 years old, ancient for the 15th century, and he had spent most of his adult life at sea. Perhaps his health finally failed. Perhaps the rigours of one more voyage were too much. But his death marked the end of an era. The new emperor Facing pressure from Confucian bureaucrats and concerned about the expense of maintaining the fleet, decided not to commission any more voyages. The treasure ships were decommissioned. They sat in harbours rotting away. Some scholars believe that officials actually ordered many of the ships to be burned, though exact information about their fate is unclear. More devastating than the destruction of the ships was the destruction of knowledge. Officials who opposed the maritime expeditions systematically destroyed records of Zheng He's voyages. Maps were lost, sailing directions were burned, technical specifications for the treasure ships disappeared. The institutional knowledge accumulated over decades of building and sailing the world's greatest fleet was deliberately erased. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Ming officials had banned maritime trade altogether. China turned inward. The coast was closed. Shipyards were shut down. Chinese craftsmen lost the knowledge for building large ocean-going vessels. Within a few generations, the fact that China had once dominated the seas was almost forgotten. This policy of isolation continued for centuries. While Europe entered the age of exploration, building on maritime technologies they had learned partially from contact with Asian vessels, China deliberately chose to abandon the sea. By the time European ships arrived in Chinese waters in force in the 16th and 17th centuries, China had lost its naval advantage entirely. Why did this happen? Why would a civilization at the peak of maritime power deliberately choose to throw it away? The reasons are complex and debated by historians. The financial burden was real, the voyages were expensive, and the return on investment, while significant in terms of prestige and tribute, didn't generate enough direct revenue to satisfy budget-conscious officials. The Mongol threat from the north remained the primary military concern, and the army lobbied for resources to be directed toward land defences, including the reconstruction of the Great Wall. Political factors played a role. The Voyages had been the emperor's project, managed by eunuchs like Zheng He, who held the emperor's personal trust. Confucian scholars, who dominated the civil bureaucracy, resented the power and influence of the eunuchs. Ending the Voyages was a way to reduce eunuch authority and reassert bureaucratic control. Ideological factors mattered too. Confucian philosophy emphasized self-sufficiency, hierarchy, and looking inward for moral perfection. The idea of projecting power abroad, of trading as equals with foreign nations, of learning from other cultures, all of this conflicted with the Confucian worldview. When Confucian scholars gained influence in the court, they used it to end policies they had always opposed. There may have been environmental factors as well. The construction of the fleet had required enormous quantities of high-quality timber. Deforestation was becoming a problem in some regions. The specialized hardwoods needed for the largest ships may have become scarce. This would have made future ship construction more difficult and expensive. Whatever the combination of factors, the result was clear. China withdrew from the seas just as Europe was beginning to explore them. The timing was catastrophic from a historical perspective. If China had continued its maritime development, if it had maintained the treasure fleet and extended its reach even farther, the entire trajectory of global history might have been different. Instead, the knowledge faded. The ships rotted, the shipyards closed, and Zheng He's incredible achievements were largely forgotten. For centuries, Chinese historians barely mentioned Zheng He. The Confucian scholars, who controlled historical records, minimized his accomplishments or omitted them entirely. It wasn't until the 20th century that Chinese and international historians began to seriously research the treasure voyages, piecing together the story from fragmentary records, archaeological evidence, and accounts by foreign observers. Today, Zheng He is celebrated as one of history's greatest navigators and explorers. There are monuments to him throughout Asia. The Tai Kak Xie Chinese Taoist temple in Semarang, Indonesia, features a statue of the great admiral. A cenotaph tomb was erected on Niushu Hill in Nanjing, believed to contain his clothes and headgear rather than his body, honouring his role in Chinese maritime history. July 11th, the date of Zheng He's first voyage in 1405, is now officially recognised as China's Maritime Day. The Longjiang Shipyard site has been preserved as the Nanjing Zheng He Treasure Ship Ruins Park. Archaeological work continues there, uncovering more artefacts and evidence of the extraordinary scale of Ming Dynasty shipbuilding. Modern Chinese artisans have attempted to recreate the treasure ships. Fu Kungxiang, a master craftsman, spent years building detailed scale models of the entire fleet, using traditional techniques like mortise and tenon joinery and watertight bulkhead construction. His models, built at scales of 150 and 1/100, required teams of craftsmen and extraordinary attention to detail. The smallest pulleys are just 2 millimeters long. The models have been exhibited around the world, reminding people of China's maritime heritage. There have been attempts to build full-scale replicas. In Nanjing, workers used many 15th-century construction techniques to build a reproduction treasure ship, including the traditional mixture of tung oil and lime powder for waterproofing. The scale of the project, even with modern tools and materials to assist, gives a sense of the achievement represented by the original fleet. A log 52 feet long and weighing 8 tons must be turned and shaped. Masts must be erected using pulleys and human strength. The magnitude of what the Ming shipyards accomplished becomes viscerally real. Archaeological research continues to uncover new evidence. In 2023, excavations in the South China Sea discovered Ming Dynasty shipwrecks along routes used by Zheng He's fleet. These ships, though smaller vessels engaged in private trade rather than the treasure fleet itself, provide insights into Ming maritime commerce and shipbuilding techniques. Pottery, porcelain, and ironware recovered from these wrecks, many from the famous kilns of Jingdezhen, demonstrate the quality and volume of goods being transported. There are ongoing searches for Zheng He's ships themselves. For years, Chinese government-funded expeditions have used military-grade sensing equipment to search the seafloor along Zheng He's routes, particularly off the coast of Sri Lanka, where it's believed one of the treasure ships might have sunk. In 2024, researchers announced positive results from sonar imaging, suggesting they may have located shipwreck sites or artifacts. If a treasure ship is ever discovered and excavated, it would provide definitive answers to many of the questions about their size and construction. What can we learn from Zheng He's story? What does it tell us about human capability and the forces that shape history? First, it demonstrates that technological and organizational sophistication isn't confined to any one culture or era. In the early 15th century, when Europe was emerging from the medieval period, China had already achieved levels of maritime technology that wouldn't be matched in the West for centuries. The treasure ships incorporated innovations like watertight bulkheads, axial rudders, and complex rigging systems that gave them genuine advantages. Chinese navigation, using compasses, star charts, and accumulated knowledge of currents and routes, was more advanced than anything available in Europe at the time. Second, it shows that individual leadership matters. Zheng He was a remarkable man, born into circumstances that would have destroyed most people, sold into servitude, physically mutilated. He nonetheless rose to become one of history's great commanders. His intelligence, his loyalty, his diplomatic skills, his military acumen, and his organizational genius made the treasure voyages possible. The fleet wasn't just ships and sailors, it was Zheng He's vision and capability that held it all together. Third, it illustrates how cultural and political forces can elevate or extinguish achievement. The Yongle Emperor's ambition and support enabled the treasure voyages. His willingness to invest enormous resources, to trust capable subordinates like Zheng He, to pursue a bold vision of China's role in the world, made possible one of history's great maritime achievements. But when political winds shifted, when different values dominated the court, those same achievements were dismantled. knowledge was deliberately destroyed. Capabilities were abandoned. The choice to turn inward, to view maritime commerce with suspicion, to prevent any continuation of the voyages, had consequences that echoed through centuries. Fourth, the story reveals something profound about the nature of exploration and its purposes. Zheng He wasn't sailing into the unknown. The Chinese had been trading with Southeast Asia, India, and even East Africa for centuries before the treasure voyages began. The routes were well established. But what Zheng He accomplished was organizing these contacts on a grand scale, using the power and prestige of the state to establish formal diplomatic relationships, to secure favorable trade terms, to project Chinese power and culture across thousands of miles. The Europeans who followed Columbus and da Gama were often searching for new routes to establish destinations, trying to bypass Arab and Venetian middlemen in the spice trade. They were motivated by profit, by competition, by the desire to spread Christianity. Their voyages led to conquest, colonization, and the tragic exploitation of indigenous peoples. Zheng He's voyages were different. They were primarily diplomatic and commercial. While the treasure fleet could and did use military force when necessary, the goal wasn't conquest. It was to establish tributary relationships, to demonstrate Chinese superiority through displays of wealth and technological prowess, to bring foreign nations into China's orbit peacefully. There's no record of Zheng He attempting to claim territory or establish colonies. The fleet arrived, traded, negotiated, impressed local rulers with gifts and the sheer scale of Chinese capability, and departed. Which approach was better? That's a question historians still debate. The European model led to centuries of colonial exploitation, but also to the global spread of ideas, technologies, and ultimately to the interconnected world we live in today. The Chinese model was arguably more respectful of foreign sovereignty, but led to China's isolation and eventual vulnerability to Western imperialism. What's clear is that China had a choice. In the early 15th century, they possessed the capability to dominate global maritime trade. They had the ships, the navigational knowledge, the organizational capacity, and the resources. If they had chosen to continue, if they had maintained and expanded the treasure fleet, if they had established permanent trading posts along their routes, the entire balance of global power might have shifted. Instead, they chose to stop. And within a few generations, the knowledge of how to build treasure ships was lost. The routes were forgotten. The capability disappeared. But we shouldn't view this entirely through the lens of missed opportunities. The Chinese civilization that chose to turn inward was making decisions based on its own values and priorities. Confucian philosophy wasn't wrong to emphasize internal harmony over external expansion. The concern about excessive imperial spending wasn't baseless. The desire to focus resources on defending against the Mongol threat was rational. The tragedy isn't that China made different choices than Europe would later make. The tragedy is that the knowledge was destroyed rather than preserved. If the records had been kept, if the ships had been maintained even in reduced numbers, if the institutional knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation had been passed down, China could have retained the option to resume maritime activities when circumstances changed. Zheng He's treasure fleet represents human achievement at a remarkable level. The engineering that created ships of unprecedented size, the organizational genius that coordinated hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of people across voyages lasting years, the navigational skill that crossed thousands of miles of open ocean reliably and repeatedly, the diplomatic capability that established relationships with dozens of foreign nations, the logistical mastery that kept the fleet supplied, maintained, and effective throughout 7 major expeditions. All of this was accomplished in the early 15th century, using technologies and techniques that seem primitive by modern standards, but were sophisticated and effective for their time. The treasure fleet demonstrates that with vision, resources, and capable leadership, humans can accomplish extraordinary things. Consider what this meant in practical terms. When Zheng He's fleet departed from Nanjing, they had to navigate the Yangtze River to reach the ocean, a journey that required different skills than ocean sailing. The treasure ships, with their deep keels and massive size, needed careful handling in the river's currents. The fleet would gather at Longjiang, where Zheng He made offerings to the goddess Tianfei, seeking divine protection for the voyage. This wasn't just superstition, it was recognition of the dangers they would face. From Longjiang, the fleet proceeded to Taiping anchorage in Yongle, waiting for the favourable northeast winter monsoon. Timing was everything. Leave too early and you'd fight against contrary winds. Leave too late and you'd miss the optimal sailing season. The fleet would wait weeks if necessary, and during this time, final preparations were made. Supplies were loaded, equipment was checked. The crews drilled and trained. When conditions were right, the fleet would depart through the Wuhumen, the 5 Tiger Passage of the Min River in Fujian. Imagine the sight. Hundreds of ships, the largest with their multiple masts towering above the water, their red silk sails being unfurled in sequence, the commands echoing across the water. The coordinated movement as this massive fleet began its journey into the South China Sea. The passages through Southeast Asian waters presented their own challenges. The region was a maze of islands, reefs, and narrow channels. Currents could be treacherous, storms could appear with little warning. But Zheng He's fleet had detailed knowledge of these waters. They knew which channels were deep enough for the treasure ships. They knew where to find shelter when weather threatened. They knew which ports were friendly and which might harbour pirates. The stops along the way were carefully choreographed diplomatic events. When the treasure fleet arrived at a foreign port, it wasn't a casual visit. The sheer scale of the fleet's appearance was calculated to overwhelm and impress. Hundreds of ships appearing on the horizon, the treasure ships at the centre, like floating palaces, the smaller vessels arranged in protective formations around them, the banners and flags displaying Ming imperial symbols, the sound of drums and bells as the fleet approached. Local rulers would be invited aboard the treasure ships to witness Chinese wealth and sophistication firsthand. The ship's interiors were decorated with fine silks, carved wood panels, and displays of porcelain and other luxury goods. The Chinese officials wore elaborate robes that demonstrated the empire's textile craftsmanship. The gifts presented to foreign rulers, carefully selected silks, porcelain vessels, lacquerware, metalwork, all reinforced the message of Chinese superiority. In return, foreign rulers presented their own gifts and pledges of loyalty to the Ming Emperor. These exchanges were highly ritualized. The tributary system wasn't just about trade, it was about establishing a hierarchy with China at the center. Foreign nations acknowledged Chinese supremacy, and in return, they received generous gifts, protection from pirates and rival powers, and access to Chinese goods through official trade channels. The voyages also had a military dimension that shouldn't be overlooked. Each treasure ship carried cast bronze cannons with a range of 800 to 900 feet. While the ships weren't primarily designed for warfare, they could defend themselves effectively. The fleet included dedicated warships, 5-masted vessels about 165 feet long, designed specifically for combat and patrol duties. These warships could pursue and engage pirate vessels or any other threats. The fleet soldiers, numbering in the thousands, were trained in naval combat, boarding actions, and amphibious operations. When Zheng He needed to conduct military operations, as he did against the pirates at Palembang or the Usurper in northern Sumatra, he could land substantial forces and support them from the ships. The combination of naval firepower, well-armed marines, and the psychological impact of the fleet's size made Zheng He's forces effectively unbeatable by any local power. But military force was always a last resort. Zheng He's preferred approach was diplomacy backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming power. The fleet's appearance alone was usually enough to secure cooperation. Who would risk opposing an admiral who commanded hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men? The rational choice was to negotiate, to accept Chinese terms, to benefit from the tributary relationship rather than resist it. The economic impact of the voyages extended far beyond the immediate trade. When the fleet visited a port, it created a temporary boom in the local economy. Thousands of men needed food, water, and supplies. Local merchants rushed to sell provisions to the Chinese. Services of all kinds were in demand. The spending by the fleet and its crews could temporarily transform the economy of a small trading city. More importantly, the voyages established Chinese merchants and communities along the routes. Chinese traders, inspired by the official expeditions and protected by the tributary relationships Zheng He established, emigrated to Southeast Asia, India, and beyond. Chinese communities in modern Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and other nations often trace their origins to this period. The voyages didn't just create temporary contacts, they established lasting networks of people, trade, and cultural exchange. The cultural exchanges worked in both directions. While Zheng He projected Chinese culture abroad, he also brought foreign knowledge and goods back to China. The fleet's pharmacologists collected samples of medicinal plants from foreign lands. Some of these were new to Chinese medicine and enriched its pharmacopoeia. Food delicacies like shark's fin and birds' nests were said to have been introduced to China through Zheng He's voyages. Foreign music, art, and crafts influenced Chinese culture. Religious tolerance was a notable feature of the voyages. Zheng He himself was a Muslim, as were many of his subordinate commanders and crew members, but the fleet also included Buddhists, Taoists, and followers of Chinese traditional religion. Zheng He made offerings at Buddhist temples and erected inscriptions invoking both Buddha and Allah. This syncretism reflected Ming Dynasty society's relative religious tolerance and helped Zheng He establish good relations with the diverse religious communities encountered along the routes. The stone inscriptions Zheng He left behind are among the most important historical records of the voyages. The 1407 Longjiang stele and the 1431 Yongle stele contain descriptions of the voyages written in Zheng He's era, providing first-hand accounts rather than later histories that might be distorted or exaggerated. These inscriptions describe the fleet's composition, list the places visited, and express the voyage's purposes in terms of bringing foreign nations into the Chinese tributary system and demonstrating the transforming power of imperial virtue. One inscription boasts, "We have traversed more than 100,000 li of immense water spaces and have beheld in the ocean huge waves like mountains rising sky high." A li is approximately a third of a mile, so 100,000 li represents about 25,000 miles, matching the total distances covered across all 7 voyages. The inscription continues, "We have set eyes on barbarian regions far away, hidden in a blue transparency of light vapours, while our sails, loftily unfurled like clouds day and night, continued their course as rapidly as a star traversing the savage waves." The language is poetic, but it captures something real about the experience of ocean sailing in the age before steam, the sense of distance, of travelling through vast empty spaces. The awesome power of storms at sea, waves that truly do rise like mountains. The stars used for navigation, guiding the fleet through the darkness. The constant motion, day and night, as the ships rode the monsoon winds toward distant shores. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge that confirms and enriches the historical record. In Hormuz, on an island in the Persian Gulf, archaeologists have found Chinese blue and white porcelain sherds dating to the early 15th century, the period of Zheng He's voyages. Some of these sherds bear rain marks from the Yongle era, directly linking them to the time when Zheng He was sailing. The types of porcelain found match descriptions of goods carried by the treasure fleet. In the tomb of King Liangzhuang in Hubei province, over 3,400 pieces of Persian and Indian jewellery and gemstones were discovered. These treasures, weighing a total of 43 kilograms, include 589 pieces of goldwork, 392 pieces of silverwork, and numerous jade ornaments. The collection contains 18 different types of gemstone: chrysoberyl, emeralds, sapphires, rubies, and others. Analysis suggests these were diplomatic gifts brought back from Hormuz and other Persian Gulf ports during Zheng He's fourth and fifth voyages. The porcelain trade was particularly significant. Chinese porcelain was highly prized throughout Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. The technology for producing fine porcelain, especially the blue and white porcelain from Jingdezhen kilns, was unique to China. Foreign rulers coveted Chinese porcelain for its beauty, its translucency, and its association with Chinese civilization's prestige. Zheng He's fleet carried vast quantities of porcelain for gift-giving and trade. In return, China received goods not available domestically: spices from India and Southeast Asia, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves and nutmeg, precious woods like sandalwood and agarwood used for incense and fine furniture, gems and precious metals, exotic textiles, medicinal ingredients, and of course the exotic animals that so delighted the Ming court. The giraffe presented to the Yongle Emperor in 1414, brought back from one of the African voyages, caused a sensation. Chinese had never seen such a creature. Its long neck, its gentle temperament, its unique colouring, all seemed to match descriptions of the Qilin, a mythical beast whose appearance was supposed to herald a golden age of peace and prosperity. Court scholars debated whether this really was the legendary Qilin. The emperor chose to interpret its arrival as a sign of heaven's approval for his reign and his policies, including the treasure voyages. But beyond the symbolism, the giraffe and other African animals demonstrated the geographic reach of Zheng He's expeditions. To bring a giraffe from East Africa to China required travelling approximately 6,000 miles each way. The animal had to be kept alive aboard ship for months. It needed food, water, and care. The fact that the Chinese succeeded in this shows remarkable capability in animal husbandry and long-distance transport. The seventh and final voyage, from 1430 to 1433, was in many ways the most poignant. Zheng He was elderly, probably in his early 60s, in poor health, and aware that political support for the voyages was eroding. The Xuande Emperor had ordered this expedition, but sentiment at court was clearly turning against further maritime adventures. Zheng He must have known this would be his last voyage. The fleet visited the familiar ports one final time: Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, East Africa. At each stop, Zheng He renewed diplomatic relationships, conducted trade, and said farewell to rulers and merchants who had become familiar over decades of visits. The fleet was smaller than on earlier voyages, perhaps reflecting reduced funding or difficulty recruiting crews for what everyone knew might be the last expedition. Zheng He died on this voyage, either at Calicut or during the return journey. The exact date and circumstances aren't recorded. Perhaps there was a brief ceremony aboard his flagship. Perhaps his subordinate commanders said words honouring his service to the emperor and to China. His body, or perhaps just his clothing and personal effects, if he was buried at sea or in a foreign land, was brought back to China and interred in a tomb on Niushou Hill near Nanjing. The fleet returned to China in 1433 without its admiral, and almost immediately the political forces that had opposed the voyages began dismantling everything Zheng He had built. The Confucian scholars, who had always viewed the expeditions as wasteful extravagances, pressed the emperor to end them permanently. They argued that the resources spent on ships and voyages should be redirected to defense against the Mongols, to infrastructure projects within China, to supporting agriculture and reducing the tax burden on peasants. These weren't entirely bad arguments. China did face real security threats from the north. The economic burden of the voyages was substantial, but the decision to not just end the voyages, but to actively destroy records and prohibit future maritime expeditions went far beyond fiscal prudence. It reflected a deliberate choice to turn away from the sea, to view foreign contacts as corrupting, to define Chinese greatness in terms of internal perfection rather than external engagement. But it also demonstrates how fragile such achievements can be. Knowledge can be lost, capabilities can be abandoned, political and cultural forces can override practical advantage. The same civilization that created the world's most powerful navy could choose to destroy it and forbid any repetition of its voyages. Today, as we look back across 6 centuries, Zheng He's achievement seems almost mythical. Ships so large they might be impossible. Voyages so extensive they challenge belief. An admiral who rose from slavery to command history's greatest fleet. And then it all disappeared, deliberately erased, leaving only fragmentary records and scattered archaeological evidence. But it was real. The treasure ships sailed. Zheng He commanded them. For 3 decades, from 1405 to 1433, China dominated the seas from the western Pacific to the eastern coast of Africa. They demonstrated what humans could accomplish when ambition, capability, and resources aligned. The modern world is rediscovering and celebrating this achievement. We're building replicas, conducting archaeological research, preserving historical sites, and honouring Zheng He's memory. We're recognizing that the story of human exploration and maritime development isn't just a Western story. Long before Columbus, before da Gama, before Magellan, Admiral Zheng He was sailing the Indian Ocean with fleets that dwarfed anything Europe would build for centuries, and we're grappling with the questions his story raises. What determines which civilizations pursue exploration and which turn inward? How do cultural values shape technological development? Why is knowledge sometimes preserved and sometimes deliberately destroyed? What role do individuals play in shaping history, and how much are they constrained by larger forces? Zheng He's treasure fleet is a reminder that history is full of roads not taken, capabilities not pursued, knowledge not preserved. It's a celebration of human achievement and ingenuity, and it's a cautionary tale about how easily greatness can be lost when we choose not to value it. As we contemplate our own era, with its unprecedented technological capabilities and global interconnections, perhaps we can learn from Zheng He's story. The knowledge we accumulate, the capabilities we develop, the achievements we accomplish, all of these are fragile. They depend on continued support, continued investment, and continued commitment to preserving and building upon what previous generations achieved. The treasure ships are gone. The detailed maps are lost, but the story survives, a testament to what humans can accomplish when we choose to reach beyond our borders, to sail into the unknown, to connect with distant peoples, and to demonstrate through our achievements what we're capable of. Zheng He stands as one of history's great figures, a man who overcame impossible odds to command the greatest fleet the world had seen. His voyages expanded human knowledge, established networks of trade and diplomacy, and demonstrated Chinese maritime supremacy. That this achievement was later abandoned makes it no less remarkable. It only makes it more poignant, a glimpse of what might have been if different choices had been made. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine those 300 ships on the horizon, their red silk sails filling with the monsoon wind, their ornate prows cutting through the waves. Imagine Admiral Zheng He standing on the deck of his flagship, 7 feet tall, his voice like a great bell, commanding this floating city with confidence and skill. Imagine the wonder felt by people in distant lands when this magnificent fleet appeared at their shores, demonstrating a level of maritime capability they had never imagined possible. It really happened. For a brief shining moment in history, humans built and sailed the largest wooden ships ever constructed. They navigated across oceans with precision. They organised expeditions on a scale that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They showed what was possible, and then by choice, they stopped. The story of Zheng He's treasure fleet is a story of human achievement and human choice, of capabilities gained and capabilities lost, of glory earned and glory abandoned. It's a reminder that we are the inheritors of tremendous knowledge and capability accumulated across generations. And it's a warning that if we don't value, preserve, and build upon what we've inherited, it can all disappear, leaving only fragments and legends. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most remarkable maritime achievements. Tomorrow, we'll explore another forgotten wonder, another story of human ingenuity and capability. Until then, sleep well and dream of distant horizons and impossible voyages accomplished by people who refuse to believe in limits. This has been Soft Spoken Mysteries. Good night.